When you lose the fundamental reason for doing something as a leader, then I think it's time for you to check out.
Welcome to a brand new episode and a fairly new season of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and more urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
We make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, covering topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and resilience, and from climate change to AI. If it's about the status of leadership in 2025, it will be on our podcast.
And we're not here for the shiny corporate case studies either. We want to share stories from leaders who have learned lessons and made progress the hard way. We want our podcast to share ideas and to inspire others.
In this episode, we'll be sharing our conversation with Brian Dow, Chief Executive of Mental Health UK and the Deputy Chief Executive of Rethink Mental Illness. We spoke with Brian soon after Mental Health UK published their 2025 Burnout Report in January, and you may have seen this in the press. The report highlights several key points about stress, burnout, and generational differences in the workplace. And Paul, you and I had a really interesting conversation about mental health recently, didn't we, when we were on the train on the way to a gig?
Yeah, travelling into London, having those lucid conversations in the evening. And I think it was more around the issues with mental health and running your own business. I think we both have experience of worry and concern. You know, running your own business is great. It's wonderful. It gives you freedom and it gives you all the things that, you know, we set them up, I think, in the first place for. But I think I was expressing concern about finances and about business pipelines and about how that really, really impacts your day to day when you're running your own gig, and sleepless nights and things like that I think can really, really impact you. So, number one, it was very useful to share some of that with you because you've been through all of that, and it was useful to get your insight. And B, problem shared is a problem halved. So I think it was a good conversation to have, and fairly soon after we'd had this conversation with Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Brian's conversation was a really useful backdrop, I think, because his mental health is still a hard thing to talk about, isn't it? I mean, it shouldn't be in 2025, but it often is. And sometimes I think reaching out to your peer group, however much you like and trust them and they've become good friends, again, it's not always easy, is it? So you did a great thing there, because in order to have the conversation in a really meaningful way, it is about being a bit vulnerable, isn't it? And it is about opening up and saying, I have concerns about these things. And goodness me, we've all been there, haven't we? Especially with the world in the state it is right now. So I think just the act of having the conversation is a really brave thing. And what I took away from the interview with Brian is that we all need to make a collective effort to make having that conversation more normal. And we all have a responsibility to do that.
Yeah, it was interesting. So I think one of the questions you asked me later on in that evening was podcasts that I was listening to, and my answers are usually football related. But I do listen to Kermode and Mayo and their film reviews, and one of the things that they do at the end of their session is they just have a general sort of questions from the audience. And somebody had written in, what are the signs? What's the first sign that you notice when you know that somebody's not doing okay?
Oh, wow!
And obviously, there's some subtext there, perhaps. But one of the things that Mark Kermode said was, you just make sure you ask. That's the main thing. The minute you notice anything awry, whatever it might be, whether it's they were saying a sort of a switch in behavior. Maybe it's alcohol related. Maybe it's suddenly swearing a lot or something like that. Where you can see that somebody is under pressure. It's just to ask the question, "Are you okay?" And I think that's part and parcel of what we should all be doing as leaders. So hearing that message sometimes can be something that it's something that people need to hear and people that need to ask.
Yeah, definitely. It's never a wasted conversation, is it? It's really important to show that you're open and you're willing to have it.
Yeah. And so, speaking of that, last time on the podcast, we spoke about a Guardian article that explored the impact of AI on children. And it's interesting timing that in this episode, Brian highlights burnout amongst young people in the workplace. So, whilst this isn't completely driven by technology, we do seem to have very regular conversations about the impact of technology, and in particular, the way and the effect it might have on our mental health and on the younger generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, goodness me. I mean, what a week to be having this conversation when I don't think any of us can move, can we? For all of the sort of articles, all of the social media posts that are being written about adolescence, and this is a program that you've seen, Paul. That's one that's on my list, and I haven't seen yet. And I'd be really interested to hear more about what you think about it.
Yeah, so the Netflix show Adolescence, as you said, everyone's talking about it, so we should too. And I think we were quite blown away by it. And it feels a bit trite to say, but as parents of two teenage boys, it was right in our wheelhouse. Really, it was something that I think we both probably didn't want to watch, but needed to watch, if that makes any sense at all. And it's a technical feat. It's amazing. Each of the 4 episodes is filmed seamlessly, one shot from beginning to end. And the acting performances are absolutely incredible, especially the young boy at the centre of all of this. For somebody that's inexperienced, I think it was his first acting role. It was absolutely phenomenal. But beyond all that, I think the most important thing about it is the conversation that it's started. So I don't need to give any spoilers away to say that there is quite a lot of conversation about young boys in particular, and the influence of social media and technology on and games and the internet and everything they're reading and everything they're seeing on their well-being and mental health, and really questioning the sort of their maleness, I guess, and what it means to grow up as a boy in a culture where masculinity is seemingly, in their eyes, in some people's eyes, under threat. And as I said, 2 young boys in the house, going through all the things that young boys go through. And I think you sort of realise that they are under attack, if you like, from things that parents don't ever really see. So everything they're seeing and everything they're consuming through their devices and through their phones, through their devices, and through the media that they consume, is chipping away at their sort of the way that they see the world and their own decision making processes on what they're seeing and what they're consuming. So quite worrying. What have you taken away from some of the discourse that you've seen? I know you haven't seen the show, but
well, firstly, I definitely need to watch it. I need to sit down with my husband and find some time to do that, because it feels really socially significant, really culturally significant. And like you say, the show started this whole conversation about young boys, men, the signals that are being sent out to them through social media, just the effect that social media is having on young people. And absolutely, there's a live issue in this house as well with a teenage son, and also a girl who's going to be a teenager later this year. So I'm really, really interested to watch it and to find out what I need to do differently as a parent in order to support them, because I think that I worry about what we put into the hands of children with social media, with phones, and whether their brains can cope with all the information, all the content, all the messages that they're seeing.
Yeah. I read somewhere today, and I've not got it in front of me, and I could go off and I could have a look, or we could just sort of make it up as we go along. But something along the lines of the frontal cortex is not fully developed in children until at least mid to late 20s. Now, for girls, it's sooner than it is for boys. And that's quite concerning. So what it was basically talking about was parents. The role of parents is to be the part of the brain that is underdeveloped in your children, which is quite a thought. And that feels quite challenging. It feels quite daunting, and it feels quite, did I sign up for this? When you think about your childhood and the way you grew up, it's probably a little bit different, probably different for me than it was for you. But everything was visible. It was all about stranger danger, the Green Cross code. If you had issues as a child, you were given the Esther Ranson was on the television talking about Childline, and we all remember that phone number. This is all invisible if you don't look and you don't ask and you don't talk to your children. And I think that was the call for me and Daph, was my wife, definitely. Sorry, I should have introduced her more formally. But that was the sort of the wake up call for us. Not a wake up call as such, but we sat there and we watched it. And we immediately had the question: should we watch this with the boys? And I know some people have watched it with their children, and it would be a challenging watch. But I think I probably would now. Whether I could put myself through watching it again, I'm not sure. But watching it with the children might not be a bad idea. So that might be the one piece of advice, or what's one thing we should talk about further, maybe offline, is whether you see it as an opportunity to sit down and watch it with your children as part of a conversation, I guess, that your family needs to have about all this stuff, and bring it right out into the open, because that's something that we took away from it and thought maybe we should do that. So maybe we'll check back in a couple of episodes' time where we've taken that plunge and watched it with them.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, a tough watch, but I completely recommend that you do, and it will prompt many a conversation. And I think that's the main thing. That's the biggest takeaway from it at all. I think it's getting a bit of a backlash already. Of course, these things do, in terms of, I think it was overhyped, and I think it was this, and I think it was that. But if it starts the conversation between parents and their kids who wouldn't normally have that type of conversation, then I think it can only be a very, very good thing.
Agreed.
So now for our interview with Brian Dow.
We are very excited to welcome Brian Dow, CEO of Mental Health UK, to Starts at the Top today. Brian is Chief Executive of Mental Health UK and the Deputy CEO of Rethink Mental Illness. He's also a member of the NHS Assembly, which advises the board of NHS England on delivery of the NHS Long-Term Plan. And he's also an independent member of the Lloyds of London ESG Committee. He also represents Rethink Mental Illness on the Richmond Group, a collaboration of leading health and social care charities. He began his career as a broadcast journalist in Scotland, later moving to the BBC in London. He has spent 20 years in the voluntary sector with organisations including Shelter, the School Food Trust and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Brian, welcome to the podcast. It's so lovely to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you very much for having me, Zoe. And it's we've got blue sky in London after about 5.5 years of slate grey, so it's lots of reasons to be cheerful.
Absolutely, and what a rarity. How nice to have some lovely weather. So I'm sure that's all got us in an optimistic spirit about the conditions out there. Obviously, your amazing report, which has come out recently, the Burnout Report, has some really interesting data, some really interesting insights in there that we want to dig into and hear about the state of play with burnout across the UK. Can you tell us a bit more about the report and what you've learned from it?
Yeah, so it's something we've been doing for 2 years now, and I suppose the initial reason for doing it in the first place was because we were increasingly hearing through our work with corporate partners and just generally the work that we do to go into employers, both public sector and private sector, to support staff and managers around the issue of mental health, that more and more people, not necessarily just young people, but particularly being felt, as I'll explain in a second, more so by young people, were experiencing burnout. And really, I think what we wanted to do was dig in and to understand, firstly, what people meant by burnout. Were they all meaning the same thing when they use that word? As a 52-year-old who says, I feel burnout, mean the same thing as a 25-year-old? And if they did, well, what was it that was driving that? And, what could employers and indeed what could employees do themselves to reduce that? Because what we know about burnout is it's both a kind of self-felt thing, and we know when we're in it, or rather, sometimes we know after the event that we were burnt out. But it is also felt very differently by different people. So that was the kind of the reason for doing it. And I guess this year what we found is both a consistent message from building on our benchmark year last year, and also some relatively positive movements and some more troubling things. So firstly, I guess still pretty high levels of stress being felt by people in the British workplace. And it really doesn't particularly matter, it seems, which industry you're in or actually which level you are. And the levels of stress that people are experiencing seem to be higher. It would appear that that's a combination of factors, both about the workplace itself, around job security, the length of working hours, sometimes culture, management, all of those things, as well as pressures that are related to work, but might also be outside it. So money worries, obviously a really big issue for a lot of people, particularly in the aftermath of the cost of living crisis, or arguably we're still in it. You could certainly construct an argument on that front. But also other issues around accessing healthcare, about the need to look after children and juggling different jobs. So quite a high level of stress that continues across all areas. But then what's beginning to be, I think, I guess, a bit more positive is that more employers are beginning to develop their plans to support employees around burnout, around stress. But at odds with that, there's a growing number of people, or rather, I should say, a shrinking number of people who, if you like, trust their employer. So what we've noticed is the proportion of those aged between 18 to 24 who would share those high levels of stress and help explain to a manager what they needed has dropped from 75%, so fairly confident in 2024, to 56% in 2025, and that's a pretty big drop. So when you put those two factors together, I think you begin to focus on a question that is becoming more and more prevalent in the workplace, which is, what are we to do as employers, as businesses, as organizations to support people around the issue of stress and burnout? And also at the same time, how do we encourage employees to make the right decisions about their health in the workplace so that they play their part and the responsibility that they have? So it's a really fascinating development. I think it's definitely something that's, I know, on the minds of lots of employers, and it's definitely something that we need to try to get out there and improve.
Absolutely. And wow, what a fantastic and really fascinating and worrying insight as well into that almost normalization of these levels of stress and burnout in the workplace and how they're affecting different groups. And before we started recording, Paul, you mentioned something that you had seen in another report, which really resonates with what was in the burnout report from Brian and his team. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so working with the client on strategy, and particularly around communication strategy, and one of the things that we've noticed is trust within the corporate environment is a relative low. And I've just spotted earlier this year, I think it came out in January, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out on an annual basis. But one of the things that they've highlighted this year is exactly the same. A sort of a huge decline in trust between the employer and employees. And and that's felt most keenly at a young age. Some of the younger members of staff, employees, are finding that difficult. And I guess those two things resonate, don't they? That young people may not feel that they can trust their employer and come forwards and talk to them about workplace stress and well-being. And I've just commenting that the two reports seem to sit side by side to say exactly the same thing, which is quite worrying.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got to say on a personal level, it's always gratifying when another organisation of stature goes out and does its research and finds the same thing. But less about my ego and more about the issue. I think there is a growing body of evidence that something pretty peculiar is beginning to happen across the workplace. And I suppose, we might get into this a bit later, but I suppose while not pretending that the issue of stress isn't felt across all ages, I think in particular the way that young people are experiencing stress is changing. And that's probably something to do with a combination of factors around the social contract at work. When I was 22 or 23, 5 or 6 centuries ago, the basic prospect was if you come into work and you move up through the career ladder, you'll also find yourself moving up through the housing ladder, and you'll be able to get somewhere decent to live. And by the way, you won't be arriving in the workplace with a huge amount of debt behind you if you've been at university. So there's a whole kind of range of factors, I think, that young people are feeling differently about work. But I think, as you say, Paul, that trust factor, I think, is a really potentially potent issue, because if we don't have trust in the workplace, then we will almost certainly pretty quickly have a toxic culture. And we know that businesses that have toxic culture fail, basically, sooner or later, because people don't want to work for them, or they have high levels of presenteeism or absenteeism. So, I think we need to try to get under the skin of that. And I suppose the starting point, I would say, is, and it's a challenge, is that leaders, CEOs, senior people in organizations, when thinking about the plans that they are making to support their employees, I think they need to take particularly younger people with them and trying to help design that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that trust piece feels so key, doesn't it? And co-designing with younger members of the workforce, obviously really mission critical as well. So if we build on that, if we think of maybe some leaders who we know will be listening to this podcast and they'll be thinking, oh gosh, I'm really worried about this. Am I doing enough? What should their next steps be? What would you recommend to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think if I can sort of answer the question with a question first, a lot of people, I think, in a senior position, whether that's out in the commercial world or in the public sector, are wrestling with this question: where does my responsibility begin, but also where does it stop? If an employee is saying that they, are suffering with their mental health, what's my job? And actually, what's the job of signposting onto somebody else, potentially, or employee assistance program, or potentially even encouraging people to seek clinical support? But also B, what is the responsibility that I should not engage with? What do I stay away from, and how do I avoid making it worse? So I would say the kind of starting point in building that kind of culture is to try to take young people with you. So trying to consult with young people about what it is that they feel that they need. Now, inevitably, there has to be a meeting of minds, doesn't there, on these things, because someone's reasonable adjustment is somebody else's self-indulgence. So I think there's something around just making sure that you're having that conversation. I think the second thing that leaders can do which is I say it's easy. It's easy to say, it's not always easy to do. And that's to model the right kind of behaviour, to demonstrate that you take your own well-being at work seriously, to have that lunch break, I have to say, just before we did this podcast, it's been a particularly busy morning, and I was conscious of the irony that I was sitting in eating a pot noodle 5 minutes before we were due to start. But I very, very rarely do that, I've got to say. I make a point of stopping, going out and sitting in the communal lunch area, talking to my colleagues, and making sure that you're taking breaks when you monitor, all that sort of stuff. So I think modelling behaviour is also a really important thing. And I suppose the third thing I would say is, I mean, I remember very, very clearly when I started in this job. So I'm a bit of a floor walker, I tend to go out and speak to people. I don't like being constrained to my own desk. And I remember a colleague saying to me, look, when you come over and just say, can I have a minute? It just, because of my sort of anxiety, in fact, I can see the very person right now who just walked past my desk. That was 10 years ago. That really spikes my anxiety. So if you could just tell me what you want to speak in advance, that'd be really helpful. Now, I must admit, 10 years ago, when that colleague asked me to do that thing, I thought, well, hold on a second, I'm the boss, I'm the leader, I'm got to be able to do it my way, and I like to walk over. And then I reflected and I thought, no, that's a small adjustment. And so I made a point of doing that. I'm going to pop over in a minute just to chat about this, don't worry. And I've even refined that now to a sort of, when you go to speak to people who might be relatively, it's nothing to worry about. I just wanted your advice on some, foreshadowing what you're about to do. And the reason I mentioned that slightly glib example perhaps is I think it's on us as leaders to think about the things that we can do easily that make quite a big difference to people. And there's no point really just saying, well, it wasn't like that when I was that age. Because of course, when I started, people used to think it was okay to throw typewriters at staff. And thankfully, we're not in that world anymore. So things always change and evolve. And I think we have to be willing to adapt ourselves to the different environments that we find ourselves in.
I really agree with that. I love your point about leaders having that self-awareness on the power dynamics that you always bring with you, and you can't really put them down, and it's very easy for all of us to forget about them, isn't it? But I also remember being really junior thousands of years ago now in my 20s, and people saying things like, when the boss said, oh, can you come and see me in 5 minutes? I would always assume I had done something really wrong when I hadn't done anything wrong. So you're absolutely right. And that is a brilliant example of a really small action that we can all do, but it helps set that tone, doesn't it, around consideration and empathy and building trust with your staff team. And I think that's a really brilliant thing to do. And I really loved your point as well about, because we've seen this a lot on the podcast actually, what are my boundaries as a leader? And this definitely hits home with me as well, because I like to think that I am supportive to team members who may be going through difficult times at home or something pops up in their personal life. But I'll admit one of the things I struggle with there is, well, how far should I take this? How far is it helpful? And when do I back off? And what can I signpost? What's the main way in which I can add value here as a leader and be useful and helpful and empathetic? And actually, when we had Polly Neat from Shelter on the podcast a few months back, we talked about this, and we were saying sometimes the best thing you can do is just sit with someone and give them your attention, and they're not necessarily expecting you to provide with a solution, but just the fact that they know as the leader you are really busy, but you are acknowledging this is really important to them and taking the time to sit with them and just sit in the mud with them, as I think the saying goes. That can be a useful thing to do, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more. I think the interesting thing about boundaries is that they're not always straight, are they? And I suppose it's a bit like, if we have senior people in charities listening to the podcast, they'll know this fantasy that we all pretend around the role of trustees and senior leaders, as if I'm sure it was true once somewhere, but as if it's actually ever true or helpful that trustees set the strategy up there and we, the humble officers, go off and deliver it. That's not how the world works. The reality is that border is much more porous, and trustees can be bringing their professional expertise and their lived experience to help the charity that they care about perform its role. And equally, of course, senior people in the organisation do set the strategy because they're grounded in the environment in which they're operating, and they're bringing their own expertise. And I think it's a bit like that with relationships. Actually, is you've got to not be too rigid about what it is that you think is right and what somebody else is right. I mean, after all, I don't think any of us, if we'd been asked 5 years ago, would have said, I'm going to be really comfortable talking to my line manager from my bedroom. We wouldn't have imagined that. We would have said, absolutely not, under no circumstances. But here I am speaking to both of you. I can't see any beds, but speaking to you from your home. I happen to be in my office, and that's one big boundary that's really shifted. So, and I think some good has come from that. That we're willing to see our colleagues more as individuals with lives, sometimes complex lives behind them, rather than just automatons turning up and doing a job. So yeah, you're right. There's got to be a push and a pull, and you've got to get that right as a manager. You've got time constraints and certain things you might not want to talk about. But I think just generally being willing to let yourself in if the person opens that door is a better approach to management than just treating people as numbers.
And that's a real privilege, isn't it, as a leader, when people trust you enough to let you in and share what they're concerned about, because then you start to get a sense of, well how can I help here? How can I be supportive?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm conscious of at least 2 conversations with colleagues last week about things that were going on in their private life, and I think as long as you are clear about the parameters, so I want to support you, do what you need to do to help that be successful at home, so we can adapt around work. But I can't obviously come into your house and do X, Y, Z, and just recognizing that there's a limit both to your responsibility and your power. That to me feels like the best way to handle those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really, definitely agree with that. So, in terms of the report itself, are there any other actions that you think leaders need to take? So, when they see the report, I mean, you've mentioned several pieces of really excellent advice there. Is there anything else which they should be doing?
Well, I mean, they can certainly contact us at Mental Health UK, and we do provide a lot of support to employers about how to try to get this right. I mean, we are not perfect ourselves, because frankly no organisation is, but I think the combination of those things that I talked about, having a clear strategy, trying to, as much as you humanly can, design it with people. And by the way, just to say, it doesn't have to be a strategy about burnout, to draw an important distinction. And I think burnout is both a personal thing that people experience, and it can be quite acute, so it can kind of arrive quite quickly and go quite quickly, or it can be a chronic thing because of a whole variety of factors, some in the workplace, some not in the workplace. I think the responsibility of leaders is to make sure that workplace minimizes or mitigates that as much as possible. So, trying to design that with people, your culture, I think is important. I have this thing that when everybody arrives in the organisation, I give them a little spiel, and I say, I want you to think big, think big. We're in a really important arena, a really important line of work. We're trying to do a really important thing, which is to transform the lives of people who live with mental health problems. So we need to think beyond their lives, not be too constrained by the world as it is. But equally, we've got to get stuff done. We've got to work hard, because if you just sit and think, you're dreaming. So we've got to work hard. But equally, I think, I'm sure it's true for both you, Zoe, and Paul, that when you work in an environment which is, where it's seen as being incredibly successful from the outside, but actually it's quite toxic on the inside. So it might be thinking big, it might be incredibly ambitious, an admired leader of it, brand leader doing amazing technological innovations and so on. And people are clearly working really hard because of it, and they're being very successful, but it's just horrible to work in. So therefore, the third thing for me that I will stress is to have fun. And those 3 things together, none of that's revolutionary, but they are in effect the kind of the building blocks of the culture that we attempt to have in the organisation. And taking people with us on that, I think, has been part of the reason it's been such a success.
It's funny you should mention fun, because I've just been working with a client on their strategy for the next 5 years, and there are 11 teams, more or less, who are sort of working towards their individual plans. And one of my reflections back to the partners in the organisation was that only 2 of the teams actually mentioned fun within their plans. One, it was right at the top of the page, and one I had to dig a little bit deeper to find it. But 2, very, very clear that actually the culture and the way that they got the work done was just as important as the target at the top of the page. And that was a really big reflection to go back to them and say, right, okay, there's 9 teams here that either forgot to put it on the form or don't prioritize that. And I think that's such a big thing. And it will also free up and help with those developing those relationships. You say, young people not necessarily coming forward and talking about burnout and talking about stress. And I think part of that can sometimes be down to team culture within an organization, team leadership, line management. All of those things have historically been a big challenge, particularly in the corporate world. And opening up that with a bit of fun and a bit of prioritizing that, I think, is really important.
I think so, Paul, because, after all, a happy workplace is a more productive workplace. When I give that speech to people, I do sort of say, the person who organises the softball team or gets everybody to go to the pub quiz or whatever, yeah, they're really important. If they're not doing any work, they're not thinking big, then that's not fun anymore. That's just annoying, But I think that a kind of joyful workplace is, the reason it's successful is because, I suppose in the end it comes back to that trust conversation, doesn't it? That if you feel happy and confident and safe, and you're allowed to laugh, you're allowed to have pleasure in the workplace, then you're much more likely, that's much more likely to correlate between the workplace, where when something goes wrong, somebody's not going to chew your ear off. You're going to be able to acknowledge that. And again, one of the questions I ask in interviews at the end, and I have this one on me, I'm sure a lot of people ask a similar question, is what's the mistake that you've personally made in a job that you learn the most from? And I guess I'm looking for 3 things from that. 1, the honesty to admit that you make a mistake, because you do, and because you have, because we all do. The humility to own that mistake. No doubt there were extenuating circumstances and somebody else contributed to it, or you were, whatever it happens to be. But having the humility to say, yeah, it was my thing, I did it. And those 2 things are good. But if you don't do the 3rd thing, which is to learn from mistakes and to grow and develop, then you're not going to get very far in life. And I think the reason I asked that question goes back to my that same mantras. Actually, I don't want people to hide when they've made a mistake. I want people to understand that it actually might help both them and the organisation if they acknowledge it and acknowledge what happened, and everybody learns from it. So, no, I think you're right. I think a fun workplace where people feel happy and excited to come in will inevitably get better results over the long term.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that fun feels like a very underrated thing at work. And in fact, we had someone come on our podcast, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago now, Paul, wasn't it? Was it Mike Rucker? He's the author of an amazing book called The Fun Habit, which we would highly recommend. And we were talking about resetting workplaces post lockdown, and he was making the case for exactly as he said, why fun is so important to well-being and mental health and morale. And I think what you said is particularly pertinent there, because I guess one of the things that I've noticed post lockdown, and then also perhaps in the age of AI as well, which I'm a big advocate for, but one of the things I'm worried about with that and other trends is that work could start to feel more transactional. So if we make it more fun and engaging, then you've got those very human touch points, even if you're still doing something that's quite processy. So I think you're absolutely right. And do you think fun then is a good way to almost mitigate that risk of some of those toxic workplace cultures seeping in?
Yeah, I think the question of how you become a toxic workplace and how you get yourself out of it is a really complex one, isn't it? It tends to, like the boiled frog thing, isn't it? I'm not sure that anybody comes in and says, right, well, as a newly appointed chief exec or director, my aim is to make this organisation incredibly toxic so that people hate coming in here, are terrified of making a mistake, usually kind of leave before the probation period's finished, or I don't think anybody really wants to do that. And it happens almost accidentally in a lot of places because of the kind of fear of a target or not hitting a particular milestone or whatever that happens to be, or just not dealing with poor practice and bad behaviour. So I think I do fundamentally think that kind of notion of joy is really. I tell you, quite a funny thing happened about 6 months ago. I was sitting at the kitchen table. I really do have lunch at the kitchen table, and a colleague of mine who's a sort of head of level, so a couple of levels down, but who I get on very well with, and for very great character, was introducing somebody else around the office, and she came over as I was wittering away to somebody else. And so this kind of now pretty junior person was about to be introduced to me, at which point my colleague said, "Have you met Brian? He's our new intern." Right? And we all had a good laugh about that, right? And then, I eventually introduced myself as the chief exec. And she came up to see me about an hour later, and she was like, "Oh my God, I went too far there, didn't I?" And I remember saying to her, "No, you really didn't, because it didn't change the fact I'm the chief exec, right? It didn't, my kind of position is firm enough that I didn't get issued with my P45 that day. And actually, as a little acid test of just the kind of environment we are, and the confidence that you have to make a joke and to make light of things, actually, I think that's a really good, it's just a really good example of what we're about. Now, obviously, I wouldn't expect her to do that if I was going into a meeting with the Prime Minister, but it's just, I think it just allows people to be more of themselves as well. And that is a really important thing, isn't it? That if we are now in a world where the boundaries have changed a little bit, then the corollary of that is we've got allowed to be a bit more of ourselves in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's right. And coming back to that question of young people, I mean, you've shared some brilliant suggestions about how leaders can build that trust with young people. And I just wanted to come back to that point and ask you, based on the report, based on some of the trends that you're seeing in your workplace and beyond, in terms of younger people maybe having different expectations of leaders and the workplace, what does that look like to you? What do you think? How would you describe what we're seeing?
Well, it's definitely changing. I mean, I think of that, there's no doubt. And I know that every generation will say, "Oh, it was different when I was young." But I mean, if I contrast, it's a genuinely true story that in my first first proper paid work job, I would go into the upstairs office where the managing director at the time, who will obviously remain nameless, worked alongside the kind of pool of admin staff. And I walked in one day to see a typewriter being thrown at somebody.
Gosh.
And I remember at the time thinking, should I call the police? But nobody, I mean, apart from us screaming and somebody dodging it and then him going out, nobody, it was normal. And I think the point is that back then, not all obviously, but a lot of people ruled by fear, and they used their power to instill terror. Whereas I think in the kind of in the knowledge age, then I think our job is to take people much more with us. I think it's really important not to parody people, because there is no average 24-year-old in the way there is no average 42-year-old or 55-year-old. People are coming in and they're just as diverse and just as different in their thinking amongst themselves as we all were. But if the thing that has changed is the relationship, the power relationship, that's different from any time before, then I think the exam question that comes into view is, how do you deal with that as a manager? The good side of it, I think, is that there isn't necessarily that fear of the employer, and people will vote with their feet if they think that the culture isn't the right kind of culture. They'll just move on more. They'll be more demanding, and I think that's right. People should be. And I think you can have more honest conversations. So I think when I'm talking to somebody who's 24 now, I suspect they are being much more honest about what they think than I might have been when talking to the chief exec of an organisation I'd been in 30 years ago. And I think that's all incredibly healthy. And I love young people's internationalist mindset, and they're much more open to diversity, all of which is absolutely fantastic. I think perhaps the downside is, and it's in both directions actually, it's a less defined sense of what is reasonable in the workplace. And in our report, we're really clear there is a task for managers, for leaders to do, to define what a good workplace looks like. But that's not all in management. Young people, not just young people, all employees have a responsibility to play their part, I think. And perhaps that sense of arriving in a workplace when if you're a digital native and you've been used to literally holding a big company to account because you're a social media presence, you come into your average organisation, and there's a fairly nasty shock to be had, isn't it? There's a pretty traditional analog power structure, and I think that can be quite challenging for young people. But it goes back to my sort of story at the kitchen table. I think our job as leaders is just to be a bit cool with that, and to accept the fact that they're not looking at us thinking of as terrifying gods up in Olympus, but just ordinary people who are probably quite flawed. And to be the best version of ourselves in order to earn that respect.
A few years ago, we had the pandemic and everybody's priorities suddenly shifted, didn't they? We've seen huge changes across the workplace in terms of, where people need to live, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on and on and on. And I think one of the things that might have happened is that young people probably do see work in a more transactional way to the way that we would see it. So when I remember joining an organisation a few years ago and thinking, right, well, this is where I'll start, and then I'll go to here, and then I'll progress. And, I'm not sure that either young people see that so much. Certainly seeing it within the accountancy profession, where I spend a lot of time, there's less expectation from young people entering the profession that they will make partner one day. Certainly that seems to have sort of not disappeared entirely, but there's no expectation there. I'm joining here and that's where I want to get to. And they are very quick to then look at opportunities elsewhere. They're not necessarily, we might be seeing you as a stepping stone, and that gives them a slightly more aloof approach, I guess, to leaders and leadership and authority within the organization. Because if I'm not here tomorrow, I'll be here, and that's fine. And I think that might be a sort of shift in the dynamic that certainly COVID enhanced.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the ties that bind have become that bit looser, haven't they? I mean, if you do not think that it's worth enduring 20 years in a workplace that doesn't feel like a great place to be in order never to get on the housing ladder, you're gonna shift out of an organisation quite quickly. And there is a sense, and I say this very much as a 55-year-old man and not a 25-year-old person. So therefore, I'm speaking from my own vantage point. I think there is a sense when you speak to younger people, whereas when I was young, the very wrong expectation was if you wanted to be promoted, you had to basically do the job that you wanted promoted into for about a year with no extra pay, and then somebody would eventually decide, yeah, all right, okay, we'll move you up. And I have heard conversations, and not just with young people, but where it's, well, I'm doing a good job and I've been doing it for 6 months, so I should get a pay rise. Well, no, you shouldn't, because good is what is expected. Anything less than good isn't good. So there is a job to do to do a bit of expectation management. But again, I feel like I'm talking about young people a lot, but hopefully in a generally really positive way that I think is just reflecting where society is going. I think the core task is about helping to explain how a workplace works, but also being willing to have it shaped by its employees coming into it. Because if any industry struggles to attract, in your case, Paul, if people are not wanting to be partners en masse, that means they're not wanting to stay and move up the professional ladder, and that means sooner or later that business will get in trouble and die. So you've got to find ways to retain people's interest and passion.
And are there some leaders who find that scary? Because that means partly co-designing the workplace and its culture with young people.
Yeah, and I mean, I can understand that. I mean, and I suppose I should be really clear. When I say co-designing, I don't necessarily mean sitting down saying, how should our organisation work? Here's a blank piece of paper. In the end, it's the job of the leaders to make decisions about resources and about targets and about various other things. If you didn't have that, it'd be like a an orchestra trying to perform without a conductor, and I've seen it happen, and it doesn't work. You do need a sense of timing, a sense of direction, a sense of moving at the same speed. But what you can do is consult quite widely on that and be willing to adapt where it's kind of sensible to do so. And it's interesting for us, and I'm sure this is true for lots of organisations. One of the big upsides of the pandemic is, of course, realising that people can do their jobs from, mostly anywhere. Now, you've got to have controls on that. People have got to be able to do the work, and you've got to be able to measure to see that that's actually happening. And then if it doesn't, well, then I think that always ought to be regarded as a kind of privilege that you continue to have rather than necessarily a right. But we're definitely enhanced as an organisation as a result, because we can hire a much greater diversity of people from a much wider pool, and rather than just sort of thinking you have to live within the M25. I think workplaces have to evolve or they die.
Yeah, very, very much so. So there were just a couple of other things we wanted to ask you. So when we last spoke a few weeks ago, I think it was just before Christmas, we talked about leadership and introversion and embracing that during lockdown. And I wondered whether you could share something of your own leadership journey.
Yeah. I remember a colleague, a chief exec, once saying to me, I'd been asked to speak to her about a problem in the organisation. And I remember saying to me at the end of it, after she'd listened really carefully and rejected everything that everybody had said, that, Brian, you will never, ever, ever, ever be a senior leader. And I remember thinking, I must remember that piece of advice to give to some young, ambitious person. But the reason I mention that is because I actually think, for me personally, I never particularly had designs on power or position. Actually, I've tended to go for jobs that I've been personally really interested in, and more importantly, causes that I've been interested in. So I, started life as a journalist. I was both sometimes very good, but sometimes really terrible. And I realised that if I was interested in something, I was quite good at it. But if I wasn't, I was really, really bad. So of course that means I'm not very good at coasting. And then when I started in the voluntary sector, my first role was in a human rights NGO, which was really fascinating. And it just kind of made me sense that I was somebody that was reasonably good at thinking about the kind of longer term and kind of not so much the day-to-day planning, but thinking of that thing where you work backwards from your aim, which I understand is now called a theory of change. I didn't know that when I was 27. I'm not even sure they had those back then. But and so really that's all I've done, is I've picked jobs that really interested me, causes that I really care about, because, as I say, if I don't care, then I don't think I'm very good. And being in mental health is just absolutely such a privilege to do, because it's an initiative. It affects every single person on the planet.
That's so interesting, because if I think about some of the CEOs I know, and I'm not saying this is wrong, quite often a motivation for them is about going up the ladder. And it's so refreshing to talk to a CEO where it's more been about the cause and perhaps about the impact of the role rather than the title.
Yeah. And something really funny is, as we've been having this conversation, right, 10 seconds ago, an email popped up from somebody who used to be my boss that I haven't heard from in a decade. And I remember when I first met him, he asked a question at the interview about, I was basically presenting myself as somebody who could get lots of media coverage for this organisation. And I think I'd given an example from a previous role, or the role that I was in. And he said to me, well, if you're so good at this, how come I haven't seen any of the coverage? To which I responded, well, because you're not the audience. You're not the people we're trying to get through to, actually, with the hugest of respect. And I remember him telling me after he appointed me that he really liked that answer, because he felt I was somebody that was able to tell the truth. And actually, on that note, I do think when you work on an issue that you care about, you just have a different energy to keep doing it. And the good days are the good days. The good days are the good days for anyone. But those bad days when you think everything's impossible and the hurdles are too big, I think when you've got that kind of personal conviction about a cause, that really sustains you through those difficult times.
I'm so pleased you've said that, because I started my business and recently changed my business name to Excited By for that very reason, that I wanted to bring that excitement, to bring that level. And I sort of track it all the way back to working in record shops and like basically being so enthusiastic about the music that I was listening to and playing that people would buy it. That's how I track it. But I'd argue that there are times when Excited By is probably the worst decision I've made in terms of a business name. Today, I'm not very excited by this, but I've put that branding on it, so I have to be up and doing it. But you're absolutely right. It's that enthusiasm, it's that drive that shines through. And if you see your leaders and the people that you're working with are coming in and cause-based or joy-based or excited by what they do, then they're going to get followed.
I couldn't agree more. I happened to walk past the shop. I don't know if you know Richer Sounds.
Yes.
At the weekend with my son, and I was explaining to him that this is widely regarded by its customer base as the best shop in the UK, and it always comes right at the top. And why is that? It's because, as I understand it, the people that set it up are really passionate about the project, and what they're really interested in is giving other people that passion, and not about making a profit. Of course, they need to make a profit to sustain themselves, but I think that's when you lose the fundamental reason for doing something as a leader, then I think it's time for you to check out.
That'll be the quote.
It's a really, really good way to look at it.
I hope I was looking at my handsome best.
And then if we could just ask you a final thing before we wrap up, Brian. So if we think about this time of year, and we do have the sun shining today, as you very rightly mentioned at the start of the interview, but this time of year, I mean, it still feels so cold and bleak generally, doesn't it, before we get to spring? Is there anything that we should all be doing to manage our well-being, to get through the last dregs of winter?
Go out in it. This is something I realised in the pandemic. When it's really crap weather, when the kind of rain's battering off your window and it's bleak and it's miserable, that's when you really need to go outside. Because if you sit and look at it, you just feel really depressed. If you go out in it, 3 things happen. Firstly, it's not as bad as you think. Secondly, you feel a sense of completion and challenge. You've gone out in it, you've braved it, you've endured it, you've done it, you've overcome something. And then the third thing is that when you come back in the door, your house feels warmer and much more pleasant. You're really happy to be home. And perhaps there's the metaphor in there somewhere that I think sometimes we don't notice that something is really difficult in front of us. And it's when we pay attention to it and confront it, those are the moments where we feel best about ourselves.
What a great note to end on. Thank you, Brian. Yet another piece of incredibly sage advice. And thank you so much for coming on today to share all those wonderful insights about the report, but also, most importantly, the really practical things that leaders can do about it. So thank you. We really enjoyed talking to you, and we look forward to seeing the next iteration of the report.
It's been my pleasure. It's lovely to meet you both too.
Many thanks to Brian for joining us on the podcast. So much good advice and a refreshing approach to leadership.
Yes, big thank you to Brian. Some great insight and some really good advice for self-care that we should all pay attention to. We'll include links to the Burnout Report and to the Edelman Trust Barometer, which we mentioned in the interview in the show notes. As always, we really do appreciate that you've listened to us all the way through to the end of the episode. Thank you. And you can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us to reach more people. So if you've enjoyed what you've heard, please do share us with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of Starts at the Top.
See you then, and bye for now.